In the 1920s and 1930s, the Royal Navy had a strong focus on building cruisers. This isn't surprising because capital ships were on a building holiday. Cruisers, on the other hand, were seen as necessary for a far-flung empire, to secure trade routes and hunt enemy raiders. One manifestation of this cruiser focus was the York class, a pair of heavy cruisers based on the county design, except the Yorks were built with the intention of being smaller and cheaper warships. Not really budget counties, but certainly a more budget-friendly design. One of these ships, HMS Exeter, is quite well known for both fighting Graf Spee and her loss in the Java Sea. The other member, HMS York, is talked about less often. This video will change that as we look at York and her story, one that ended in tragedy for the cruiser. However, that story began in much brighter times, in the Palmer Shipbuilding Yard on May 16, 1927. On that day, a new cruiser was laid down for the Royal Navy. Her construction would go quickly, with the ship launched on July 17, 1928. The fitting out wouldn't be quite as quick. HMS York only commissioned into the Royal Navy on May 1st of 1930, almost 2 years later. Not slow by any means, but not as fast as the initial construction. In any case, this was peacetime, so HMS York entered into quiet service. The ship would undergo her sea trials and working up period as kinks were worked out of the design. There were certain bits the Royal Navy found less than ideal. Those issues were found early enough that they could be rectified on York's sister, HMS Exeter, with the result that Exeter is sometimes considered a half-sister. Those changes weren't huge, but they were notable. Now, with that in mind, let's cover York's design and look at what the Royal Navy decided to change on her sister ship. The first thing to note about York, of course, is her displacement. A design standard displacement of 8,400 or so tons, with the deep load going higher to around 10,800 tons. This is the main feature of York's design, where she changed compared to the older county design. Now, the county class were considered satisfactory by the Royal Navy for the most part. However, they did desire a lighter and cheaper cruiser as well. This would eventually manifest in the 8,500-ton Class B cruiser concept. A smaller, cheaper design that fit budget constraints while remaining a capable warship. The biggest change to match the smaller displacement came in the form of the weaponry. HMS York carried 3 twin turrets, each equipped with 2 8-inch, 203mm guns, a total of 6 barrels. This in direct comparison to the 4 turrets and 8 barrels of the county designs. You see a similar situation with the Leander and Arethusa designs. Leander had 4 full turrets and 8 barrels, although as a light cruiser, those were 6-inch guns. Arethusa, meanwhile, was a cheaper design that lost one of those turrets, for a total of 3 turrets and 6 guns, just like HMS York, which we'll return to now. To support her main battery, the cruiser also carried 4 single, 4-inch anti-aircraft guns. These were clustered around the forward funnel with 2 to a side, and supported in turn by 2 single 2-pounder pom-poms. A fairly light anti-aircraft battery, but for 1930, not a particularly surprising one. This would, of course, be reinforced later on. The final weaponry past that point consisted of 2 triple 21-inch torpedo mounts, 6 torpedoes in all. These were carried next to the funnels, with 1 mount on either side of the ship. And with that rounding off the weaponry, let's turn to armor protection. This ranged from 3 inches thick over the machinery spaces, to just under 4.4 inches thick on the magazines, 76mm to roughly 100mm respectively. This was an improvement over the county style, which had about an inch on machinery and 4-inch armored boxes for the magazines. The speed, on the other hand, remained about the same, around 32 knots on 80,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. And with that, we finished up the design details, with one exception. Before we return to service history, I'll briefly touch on the features changed on Exeter. When you look at the two ships, one thing jumps out. York has a much taller and slimmer bridge tower, and her funnels are raked back, with the aft one also thinner. Exeter is, in general, shorter and squatter in her superstructure. The bridge, for its part, is a legacy of a failed plan on York, a plan to fit a catapult to the super-firing bow turret. That plan ended up not going through. However, it was too late to change York's bridge when that fell through, but the Royal Navy would make the change on Exeter. Now, with that done, we can go back to service. As said before, this began on May 1st, 1930. As the world was largely quiet at the time, York entered into mundane service. The cruiser initially served in the home fleet, including voyages to Sweden and Finland, before then shifting to the West Indies Squadron, where York would take up flagship duties for the 8th Cruiser Squadron in April 1934. That particular role was, however, short-lived. In 1935, York was sent to the Mediterranean Fleet. That quiet world I mentioned, that was starting to flake away. York was sent to the Mediterranean as a response to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. The British were distinctly unhappy about this and reinforced their fleet as a response. However, at the same time, the British weren't going to go to war with Italy, not over Ethiopia. So while York remained in the Mediterranean until 1936, it ultimately came to nothing. Italy conquered Ethiopia, and York returned to Bermuda. The cruiser would remain on that station from 1936 until 1939, although she did leave on various voyages to other areas, as far south as Argentina, and then as far north and west as British Columbia, as well as trips back home and to Canada at different points of her career. All fairly typical for an interwar flagship. Voyages to train the crew and show the flag while keeping the ship busy. This pattern would persist until York was relieved of this duty in March of 1939. HMS Berwick took her place, and the cruiser returned to Britain for a much-needed refit. This would last until August 2nd, 1939, when York set off back to Bermuda. This would see the cruiser return to her old stomping grounds on August 13th, 1939. Within less than a month, however, Britain would be at war. For the British, this began on September 3rd. For York, this didn't mean immediate combat duty. The cruiser, alongside Berwick, was transferred from Bermuda to Halifax, where the ships took up duty escorting convoys, the first of which, HX-1, began on September 16th, although they only escorted the convoy part of the way before returning back to Canada. This pattern would continue, at least for the early war. Meanwhile, far to the south, the Panzerschiff Admiral Graf Spee was doing her famous raiding. This prompted the British to form several formations, called forces, to hunt for raiders. These came to life on October 5th. York and Berwick formed the core of Force F for North America and the West Indies. However, York would never hunt down a Panzerschiff, while her sister Exeter would eventually engage Graf Spee. Well, York had a simpler time. She would continue to escort Halifax convoys until October 31st, at which point the cruiser would receive 2 refits. First, a short overhaul in Bermuda, lasting until November 22nd, at which point the cruiser sailed back to Britain for a proper refit. She arrived there on December 9th, 1939, after escorting one last convoy, and York would remain in refit until February of 1940. When that refit concluded, HMS York joined the 1st Cruiser Squadron of the Home Fleet. Now operating on the Northern Patrol, York hunted for German blockade runners. It wouldn't take long to find one. On March 3, 1940, York intercepted a German ship, Arukas, off the coast of Iceland, although the German crew scuttled their ship before the cruiser could capture it. Arukas slipped beneath the waves, as you can see here. The crew was fished from the water by York as their ship vanished. For her part, York turned home for Scapa Flow. There wouldn't be anything else of major note until April 7th. On that day, York began to pick up troops destined for Norway, as the British and French began to plan an invasion to secure the country and prevent a German takeover. However, the Germans got there first, beginning their own invasion on April 8th of 1940. As a result, York dropped her troops off, and instead set sail to try and catch the German invasion. This would, however, fail. York would miss a chance at the German fleet, although she did help tow a crippled destroyer, HMS Eclipse, back home, during which the cruiser avoided being torpedoed by the submarine U-48. As for Eclipse, she arrived back home on April 17th. Following this, York would ferry troops to Norway on April 24th, before then turning back around and evacuating the troops from Norway on May 1st. Summer 1940 would mostly pass quietly after this, until York was transferred to the Mediterranean in August. Her service in that theater would follow the usual pattern: convoy escorts, especially to Malta, as well as attempts to bring the Italians to battle or to engage Italian convoys, most of which came to nothing in the cat-and-mouse game between the two fleets. There were, however, exceptions to that rule. In 1940, there were 3 of these for HMS York. First, the Battle of Cape Passero. The cruiser didn't participate in the main action. She did, however, sink the crippled destroyer Artiglieri on October 13th. Apologies for my Italian. Meanwhile, the second exception came a month later, where York helped escort HMS Illustrious for the strike on Taranto on November 11th. And the final notable event came a few days later, when York helped ferry troops to Greece. This isn't to say nothing happened in the intervening time. However, most of it was pretty standard fare for the Mediterranean theater, such as a convoy escort to Malta on November 26th, or a series of strikes on Italian forces beginning on December 16, 1940. In the end, York's real excitement would come around Crete. In January 1941, she escorted a convoy to Ceuta Bay, before covering Operation Excess from January 10th to the 11th, which is best known for the damage done to HMS Illustrious. York would escape damage of her own. That continued through February and early March of 1941. York continued to operate out of Ceuta Bay, mostly on the troop convoys to Greece. York's work was a success, even if the operations in Greece definitely weren't. Unfortunately, York's role came to an end in late March. On March 26th, the cruiser was anchored in Ceuta Bay, Crete, where Italian motorboats infiltrated the harbor. 2 of these explosive motorboats would slam into York in the early morning of March 26th. They blew up on the cruiser's starboard side after the Italian pilots jumped overboard, letting their boats continue on unmanned. 2 of York's crew were killed by the explosion, which blew a massive hole in the ship's side. Both boiler rooms and 1 engine room were flooded. While York was towed to shore and beached, the cruiser was out of the war. York remained beached in Ceuta Bay, where she functioned as a stationary anti-aircraft battery, at least until German air attack would cause further damage on May 18th. York was considered damaged beyond repair after this attack. The British would wreck her turrets with demolition charges on May 22, 1941, and abandon the ruined hulk. York would be left in Ceuta Bay as the Germans took over Crete. German and Italian crews would examine the wrecked cruiser, but they left her in place. York would only be salvaged in February 1952 by an Italian salvage company. HMS York would then be broken up in Italy from March 3, 1952. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.